Welcome everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Pauline Shanks-Corinne. I'm the Stockdale Chair in Professional Military Ethics in the College of Leadership and Ethics, and this is our last Leadership and Ethics LU for the year. And when Tom and I were talking about this at the beginning of the year, we thought it would be nice to showcase some of the work of our brilliant students. So we have 4 students here. They're each going to talk for about 10 minutes. And then at the end of that time, there will be time for question and answer. So when the first speaker is talking, if you have a question, write it down. I know you all are younger than I am, but I'm at the age where I can forget things and I have to write it down. So please write your questions down and we will have about 30 minutes for question and answer. So I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Tom Freely, who's the director of our Ethics and Emerging Technology program here, along with Dr. Tip Schultz. And I have mentored a few people for papers, and so I know what a good program this is and the benefit that it brings both to Naval War College and also to the broader community. So Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, Pauline. A couple of things I want to welcome those that are in Zoom land and who are tuning in here from various parts of the country and possibly from the world as the word spread. A couple of things I do want to announce. I was just at the IEEE or Society of Social Implications of Technology at Purdue University. Ethics of technology has really taken off. In fact, Purdue offers a PhD with an emphasis on ethics of technology. This is significant. In fact, all the papers were on this topic, and the Association for Practical Professional Ethics, which used to be pretty much highly theoretical philosophy. In our last 2 conferences, not over 90% of the papers have been applied ethics on ethics of technology. And so we're looking forward to collaborating with Purdue. And then also, it was announced at Purdue that DARPA's Visiting Scholars Program in Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications was announced. And so they're starting a whole new program at DARPA for this particular topic, which is vitally important to stay in time. So we will continue. The EEMT does work with various DoD agencies and technology policy institutions. The EEMT program was started about 8.5 years ago, no, about 8 years ago, and has over 50 papers have been written on some aspect of the technology, its implications for national security, both for opportunities as well as for risks. And so we have 4 of our students here today who will make presentations on their research, their discoveries, and their recommendations. We have Lieutenant Commander Vincent Chamberlain. He is a Navy meteorological and oceanographer officer. His title is An Ethical Framework to Analyze Soldier Enhancement Using Invasive Neurotechnology. We have Susan Cranfield, Army civilian. She's an acquisitions officer. And she will be following from here, going to the Department of Defense Commander for Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office as a follow-on assignment. And the title of Susan's paper is Hidden Figures. Her stance, Reasoning Through Harms, Why the U.S. Should Adopt a Human-Centered Approach for Artificial Intelligence Development and Government. And then we have Major John C. Tremazzo, United States Army. He is an Army Judge Advocate Corps officer. The title of John's paper is Deep Fakes and the Degradation of Authenticity, a moral, ethical, and legal assessment of whether the United States government should ever employ deepfake technology. And Lieutenant Commander Arthur DeFelice. He's an intelligence officer in the Navy, as well as he serves as special assistant to the Rhode Island Attorney General. He's a Naval Reserve officer. The title of his paper is Blood on Our Hands, Ethical Implications of the World's Largest Scrum Repository. So now I'll turn it over at this time with, I believe your slides are up first. There.
Thank you, Tom. Lieutenant Commander Vince Chamberlain. My advisor was Dr. Tim Schultz. The title of my paper, a neuroethical framework to analyze soldier enhancement using invasive neurotechnology. I chose the specifics of this research field, invasive over just general neurotechnology, because of the fact that it is invasive. So therefore it raises more ethical considerations and other concerns than using potentially a non-invasive approach. And then I wanted to use soldier enhancement as a way to, one, tie it to the military, but two, there's a difference between using the technology for an able-bodied individual versus potentially a disabled individual. Did you advance the slides?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so the thesis of my paper is that the soldier enhancement using invasive neurotechnology, it requires an ethics first approach, and that needs to be kind of the core approach to utilizing this technology, and really needs to be from the soldier's perspective. So from the individual himself or herself that is undergoing this type of enhancement. And this is to prevent more potential harm than good. Militarizing invasive technology must not be solely for an asymmetric advantage. Anytime you see technological development in the military, typically it's to develop some kind of advantage over a potential adversary. For this specifically, because of the potential harm that could do for the individual, it really needs to be that ethics first soldier perspective approach. The invasive portion of this neurotechnology is the medical implanted brain computer interface, or BCI chip, also sometimes referred to as a brain machine interface, or BMI. And that has the capability to read and write to someone's brain, has the ability to communicate via thought with a machine, with a computer, or with another person who's been enhanced with a BCI chip themselves. And the invasive versus non-invasive portion, invasive, the reason why you use that is it has a higher potential spatial and temporal resolution. So you can target specific areas of the brain, whereas non-invasive, because it's on the outside of the skull, the signals have to pass through much more portions of the brain, including the skull itself, and therefore the resolution of it typically would be less. So impact on physical disabilities. So the technology was originally developed, both research and commercially, to help people that suffer from paralysis, that have a prosthesis, suffer from Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis. The image that you see on your screen there is from 2016, famous image of Nathan Copeland fist bumping President Obama on stage. He has a BCI chip implanted in his brain, and he's able with thought to move the robotic arm that is to the right of him in that image. But what if we could take that and militarize it? So what are the possibilities? So you can communicate by thought, as mentioned earlier. So a person can communicate with a machine can communicate to the person through either the feeling from the fingertips of the machine finger or machine hand, or potentially the feet of the machine, whatnot, and actually get sensation back to the individual. Or person to person can communicate, so you reduce the risks of communication between individuals being intercepted via traditional means. Well, this potentially would allow you to control unmanned systems, which brings me to the image to the right. So Jan Schuerman controlled a robotic arm using a BCI implant, similar to the previous topic with Nathan Copeland. However, she was also used in a simulator to control an F-35 through the simulator portion in flight. Although this occurred in 2015, so the technology was a little bit less developed than it potentially is now and what it will be in the future, but it proved the ability that with thought, not controlling a joystick with her thought, but controlling the actual aircraft, she was able to manipulate the aircraft in air. So what this does with the military is prevents that removing the person out of the loop of a typical unmanned system, which is what is preventing it from being widely accepted as a way to target military objectives. But why stop there? You could potentially use this to control then a robotic army. robot that is controlled by a person, it removes the person from the battlefield completely, not just from the aircraft. Or you could use it to upload knowledge into an individual. So, you have a mission that's, taking off, you get intelligence, you can push that information directly to the individual. It's also used commercially for treatment for neurological disorders. So treating depression, anxiety, fear, post-traumatic stress disorder after the fact, and Alzheimer's disease. It has the ability, as I mentioned earlier, to read and write to the brain, so it can manipulate memories in order to help someone suffering from Alzheimer's to gain or relearn memories that they may have lost. Well, from a military perspective, you can then potentially eliminate battlefield stress before a mission or during a mission, decrease the anxiety that one is incurring, prevent fear before they go on a mission, read and write to a brain during operation, or potentially eliminate PTSD before it sets in. If you can manipulate memories, you can potentially change the memories of someone before they actually relive that memory going forward. However, with all of these, it has a ton of ethical dilemmas associated with them. On the left side of the screen is the International Brain Initiative, and I bring this up just to show what other countries are developing neurotechnology or brain research. These 7 countries are working together to collaborate on research and different developments in order to further the brain research. On the right-hand side is US brain-computer interface developments that are occurring commercially. And then I have DARPA on there as the defense organization, and the different types of neurotechnology that they're attempting to develop when it comes to invasiveness. So some are specific, as in Parkinson's or epilepsy stimulation to help reduce the symptoms of that. Others have broadened to a larger scale. Neuralink, which is one of the more recent and famous due to Elon Musk owning the company, actually uses a robotic arm to implant it, or that is what it will plan on doing, because of how delicate the network is that's being implanted in the brain. So for my paper, I researched a lot of different neurotechnology type papers, and all of them touched on ethical concerns for the individual, but they were all kind of sporadic. Nothing really brought it all together into one overarching framework that could potentially be used going forward to evaluate before this technology is either researched or implemented. So up on the screen there is the 5 areas. There is a 6th across the bottom. I put in there a legal perspective would have to be included. However, that was not part of this paper, but it is addressed as further research. So within this neuroethical framework, you have the ethical lens using a multidisciplinary ethical approach, a humanity perspective that deals with really what it means to be human, and what potentially would be taken away from what you would traditionally think of as being human. Neuro rights in the middle there, which has been developed almost akin to information technology rights. So your confidentiality of data, your integrity of data, because everything has to do with thoughts and data that could be entering or leaving the brain. Medical views. So I touched on how the medical field feels about this, especially when it comes to doing enhancing an able-bodied individual, and then social implications. So from an ethical lens, I chose the multidisciplinary approach really because one of those is not going to give you a good answer, and really utilizing multiple will give you more of the ethical dilemma. So I wanted to address identifying what are potential consequences of using this technology going forward. The issue is, how long do you look forward? Do you look at just the immediate impacts of it? Do you look at what it's going to be long-term on that individual? Do you look at long-term what it's going to mean for the military? And it raises a ton of different questions. However, the military has a duty to protect its individuals when they send them, off to battle. So utilizing this technology potentially, again, removes them from the battlefield, keeps them further away from where they could get injured, get killed in action. So the military may look at it as they have a duty to look into this technology and invest in it. And then in ethics of care, because it is about the individual, it is about how they will be impacted going forward. Not only themselves, how will it impact their family? How will it impact their lives when they're not, off at war, when they're home, when they're with their family? From the humanity perspective, as I mentioned, what does it mean to be human? We need to make sure that free will is associated with this so that people aren't coerced into doing it. However, if you have a group of people in the military that are enhanced versus not enhanced, are those people not enhanced going to feel that they need to do it in order to keep up, in order to be the same as their fellow enhanced soldiers? And then they're putting a lot of trust into the military, into the doctors performing the procedures. We need to ensure that they are the center of attention when it comes to this technology. Neuro rights, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot to do with the protection of data and the distribution of that data, but also when it comes to the privacy for the individual. Do we want people to know who's enhanced and who isn't enhanced? Does that become, a potential national security issue if adversarial nations know who is and who is not enhanced within a unit? Neurosecurity has to do with basically cybersecurity for the brain. It's already been proven that these devices can be hacked into. What does that do to the person on the battlefield? Can they be hacked into? Do they become the center target for a neurological attack because they have one of these devices in it? And then what does that mean? What can an adversary do with that person if they do hack into the chip in their brain? Medical view, as I mentioned, is from the doctor's perspective. So how does this affect the health of the individual? So you're implanting some kind of probe into somebody's brain. So you're immediately going to have some kind of damage surrounding that area. You're going to have tissue issues going forward with that individual. And then do you remove the device? Do you keep the device in when they leave service, when they're done in a mission or in an area where they'll need it? And then what does that look like from a long-term perspective and long-term care? Who's responsible for caring for this individual moving forward, whether they keep it in their brain because of risk of removing it or it's taken out? And then for social implications, how does this affect society? So when this individual, let's say they have it in their brain, goes to a coffee shop, is everything being recorded around them? Are we recording all the conversations of everyone in that coffee shop? How do those individuals feel about the fact that they have somebody with that enhancement around them? Do they need to then advertise the fact that they have it? Will that do more harm than good? And then how do you reintegrate them into society? If you have this implanted for long term, what are those effects on their normal mental cognition? And how will they be able to process information and think again on their own without the aid of the chip? So finally, for recommendations, at the end of my paper, I'm sure most are familiar with the LC boards, or ethical, legal, and social implications boards. I feel that they must be given ultimate authority to completely end research and development on able-bodied individuals if they feel that it's violating the ethical, legal, or social implications that they're reviewing. I don't think it should be a recommendation to somebody else to make that decision. I think because of the impacts on an individual person, and again, what it potentially means to be human, they should be able to cut that. There's a Neuro Rights Foundation that was co-founded and chaired by Dr. Raphael Youst at Columbia University. And they work on the international, the national level to try to bring the individual's rights to the forefront of this type of technology and this development. Whether it's them specifically or other organizations, or it's incorporated into the LC as maybe a NELC or a RELC or something to put neuro rights into that discussion, also then would have to have that ultimate authority to be able to stop the development of it moving forward. And then I think the DoD must be willing to accept that an adversary or somebody else may develop and implement this technology first. The implications of that is the norms and rights and laws that are associated with it could then be potentially developed by that other nation. However, because of the impacts potentially on the individual person, I don't think that it should be developed solely to be researched and developed solely to be the first one to development and first one to implementation, solely to get that asymmetric advantage and to be the one dictating those laws and norms. And that concludes my brief.
Susan Cranfield.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Is this on? Can you hear me okay?
Okay, thanks so much, everyone, for taking time out of your day to come and hear about our papers. Thank you to Dr. Creeley and Dr. Schultz for your leadership in this program and making us all do mind-bending work. I can tell you, I very much have done a lot of mental gymnastics this year. And thank you to my paper mentor, Dr. Pauline Shanks-Curran, for putting up with my thinking process. I'll just call it that. Okay, so I'm Susan Cranfill. I'm an Army civilian and grew up in the logistics career field in the Army civilian world. And my paper topic is related to artificial intelligence. I am not a technical person either, so this felt like a very deep dive for me into a world of very much I'm familiar with. And the topic of my paper is Hidden Figures, ersatz reasoning, and true harms, why the US should adopt a human-centered approach for artificial intelligence governance. So broadly speaking, I'm sure it's not unfamiliar to any of you, the field of artificial intelligence is, let me just say, off the chain, right? In terms of like, it's trending, hashtag, you know, all of those things. But what is it really, if you peek underneath the surface? That was part of why I decided to jump into this particular topic. And so I started off by taking a look at this word called the terminology called artificial intelligence, and it feels very foreboding and like way above my pay grade. But when I dove into it, in order to make it simple for me to be able to understand it, I realized that it is just terminology that connotes math models and algorithms and data. So, you know, I have to boil things down to very simple terms, and those are the things that I can understand. Currently, the world is struggling to come up with ways of governance that really speak to how we are able to appropriately leverage this technology, which has been likened to electricity, right? And also at the same time, be very considerate in the potential ethical harms it can cause. So the national security strategy, if you've taken a look at it recently, speaks very much to partners and allies and aligning with them so that we can establish and maintain the rules-based world order. This technology is going to be very much a driver in every nation's and non-nation actors' ability to either drive towards that goal or to take away from that goal. So governance is extremely important. I do want to mention that at the moment, every single day, there is more news in artificial intelligence and with respect to governance, and you'll probably see articles and news that speak to ethicists that are technologists as well, leaving big firms in the AI space. So in my paper, I don't dive into those things particularly, but I will say that it's important for us as leaders in the profession of arms and also as just consumers of artificial technology to be aware of what it is. So I say all that as table setting to kind of illustrate why this kind of black box term of artificial intelligence is important and why governance is important. We in the US currently have a governance approach that we call responsible artificial intelligence. This is per the DoD CDAO, so I'll explain that acronym to you. So as Dr. Creeley mentioned, I am going to the Chief Digital Artificial Intelligence Office after I graduate here from the Naval War College. And it is an organization that was stood up 12 months ago to really kind of like figure out governance for the DoD. At the federal level, there is currently a framework for an AI Bill of Rights, right? So like, but you know, as the US, we don't have a specific approach yet codified in federal at the federal level, but at the DoD level and many subordinate federal organizations, have taken the initiative to build their own. So what's important is that we don't have an overall framework to work towards, and responsible AI and human-centered AI, I believe, are very different things. That's what I'm going to be arguing, or what I am arguing in my paper. I'm going to read you a definition of what responsible AI is. And this comes from the National AI Initiative, right? So responsible AI is an initiative to ensure that the United States leads the world in the development and use of trustworthy AI systems in the public and private sectors. The United States has long been a champion and defender of the core values of freedom, guarantees of human rights, the rule of law, stability in our institutions, rights to privacy, civil rights, civil liberties, respect for intellectual property, and opportunities to pursue all their dreams. So as you can tell, that's a mouthful. And what I believe we're trying to say with that is we want this technology to do a lot of things for us, and we also want it to have guardrails so that we don't violate all the things that we hold dear. So my argument is that responsible AI is one that puts the technology at the center. The technology, we are focused on the technology first and the values and rights after the fact. My definition that I came up with for human-centered AI approach for governance is one that protects fundamental human rights, prioritizes individual security, and maintains a continuous focus on the interests of all people affected by the system across the design, development, use, and oversight of the AI system's life cycle. So my research didn't yield any specific answers, but my recommendations actually hopefully will help policymakers and governance folks structure a way to ask better questions about the development of AI technology as we move forward, because the advancements in this technology are coming fast and furious I think, so I also brought a couple of books I'll share a little bit later on, but if you just ponder the difference between the technology-centered and the human-centered, why is that important? Because from a philosophical perspective, the United States is very much a human-centered approach kind of nation. It's baked into our foundational documents. I know that some of my classmates will also hit upon those points. And, you know, we come from a tradition of virtue ethics, and we also see ourselves as the good guys in the world, right? I mean, that is the legitimacy of our standing in the world. But why does that create problems? It creates problems because in the founding of this country, as you all know, we had a very limited definition of what, you know, human is. And so over time, in the last 247 years, or however long, I think that's pretty close, we have evolved to a point now where we recognize the true definition of humanity. And I feel like this technology has, if it's going to be as broad-based as electricity, it really is an opportunity for us to think through all the human-centered implications at this point, because we don't want to have to fix those things after the fact, as we have had to do with the definition of humanity, you know, evolving and us trying to kind of retrofit our foundations in order to achieve, you know, our democratic experiment of what we're trying to achieve. Okay, so hidden figures. What are the hidden figures? I mentioned earlier that it's really just math, right? So figures in terms of math models and algorithms, and then also people. So you may or may not be familiar with the movie Hidden Figures, right? So earlier on in AI history, computers were people, and we are, as human society, very apt to kind of outsource our hard work, the grind work. And we did that with humans in terms of, you know, computers. That was a job. So the point there is that if you look under the hood of any particular technology, you probably find some people. The ersatz reasoning is, I mean, the meaning of ersatz is basically it's a veneer, it's not real, it's like not the real thing. During World War II, there was a lot of ersatz kind of like substitutes for stuff like coffee, like basic staples, because they weren't available. But what we've done in terms of artificial intelligence, because it is basically math, is kind of outsource the reasoning and the mapping to either computer machines or people. And then the true harms is, in terms of like history, it was easier to see the harms of outsourcing our grind work. It was right there in front of us, we caveated and helped ourselves to feel better about it because we, adjusted definitions so that we could justify, right, outsourcing that work. But at the moment, we're kind of doing the same thing. So another hidden figure would be the AI workforce that is offshore in terms, and let me help you understand like what that is. AI on the surface seems very like, hey, there's a veneer of objectivity, right? Like, I'm not doing the calculating, like, people aren't doing the calculating, so the bias is not in there. Well, data is the active ingredient in AI, and that data has to be refined in such a way that it is capable, or that the AI algorithms and math models are able to ingest it. So you have a huge workforce. I'd highly recommend you look up Amazon's Mechanical Turk and just like kind of like read what it says this service is. There's a huge workforce that label the bazillions of data points that are available out there. And that, so if there's a sense that people are not involved, that is definitely not true. I will kind of wrap and just jump to my recommendations. So in terms of recommendations, there are ethical implications, of course, associated with all of the things that I just laid out. Data, of course, as an active ingredient. Who are we harming? Are we going to be okay with having a moment where certain things are exposed and then we as decision makers about this particular technology wish that we had looked a little bit deeper? The purpose of the human-centered approach to AI is to really focus on asking those hard questions now and not developing the technology for technology's sake, but really asking, what is it that we're seeking the technology to do? And is the data that we have appropriate for that particular task? And having tests and assurances throughout the AI development process to make sure that human rights and our fundamental rights and are protected. The recommendations that I have, and I'll just hit on two. The first one is, because this is a quickly evolving technology, our policy frameworks have to be dynamic enough to handle shifting and flexing policy in order to keep up with the evolution of this particular technology. In my research, I did find an example of, obviously policy always lags technology. And in terms of automobiles, the automobile had been in use for well over 100 years before there were real efforts to have governance and policy for safety, right? So it was like to the point of killing like 50,000 people a year before the insurance industry and the federal government started to really put some governance processes in place. And certainly with this, we don't want to replicate that. In terms of tying it to the military relevance, if AI is going to be like electricity, then, obviously we use electricity in the military, but and nuclear energy is also a technology that has military implications. And so we regulate that. So asking the right questions up front. And in terms of the second recommendation, it's to develop a digital workforce and a digital society that really kind of understands what this technology is. You don't have to be deep into it. I certainly am not one that is going to end up writing math models, but it is important to really understand it for what it is underneath the surface and understand what makes that up and also what our individual roles are in it. So my second recommendation is very much about focusing on the digital workforce and the digital society and enabling that so that all of us can become part of the feedback loop into the governance that we would like to see. Because right now in the technology, if you look at the national security strategy as well, like we're very focused on technology, but the development of the technology, not so much the use the oversight, the life cycle, what the infrastructure requires, and what that means in terms of like resources and manpower, and all of the associated things that come with this particular technology. And that is basically a wrap for me.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Mazzo, I'd like to invite people in Zoom. If you have questions, put them into the chat. And Dr. Shanks-Curran will relay those out to us at the time for question and answer. All right, she's switching slides. Okay. This works. All right, thank you very much. Hi, I'm Major John Tremazzo. I'm an Army JAG. Just wrapping up my 10 months here in the junior course. I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Creeley, to Dr. Schultz, to Dr. Shanks-Curran for accepting me into the EEMT program and arming me with tools that I didn't have before to think about our world and some of the more complicated issues, much of which Susan just talked about. And I'm going to piggyback on that and talk about one particular application of artificial intelligence, and that is deepfakes. Do me a favor, raise your hand if you've heard of deepfake. And keep them up if you've actually seen or watched a deepfake. All right, that helps me a bit. I think all good academic discussions have to begin with the definition, and deepfake is defined sort of in United States law as what you see above. That's a video, image, or audio recording, and I'll talk about all three of those, that's either generated or substantially modified by machine learning techniques in order to falsely depict events, to falsely depict the speech or conduct of an individual, or to depict individuals who don't even exist. That definition comes from the 2020 fiscal year National Defense Authorization Act, and it's not explicitly defined as deepfake, but rather machine manipulated media. I think what's missing from that definition is the intent. And today I want to talk about context and intent as it relates to deepfakes and the military's use of deepfakes. So I've proposed a definition which just adds on that deepfakes are made with intent. It could be to entertain, it could be to educate, it could be to influence, to harass, humiliate, deceive. And I think it's really important that we understand intent, because otherwise you might conclude that deepfakes are inherently wrong or inherently unethical. And I don't think that's right. And as we've learned this year, technology is not necessarily value laden. It's the application of technology that carries problems. So here we go. In reviewing the literature on deepfakes, the one thing that I thought was missing that I could add to this conversation was some sort of scaffolding to talk about all the different types: videos, audio, and images. So I've come up with 5 categories of deepfakes for you all to think about whether or not you believe the US military should employ these offensively, or rather we should only focus on detection technologies, because there are certainly foreign-made deepfakes out there which are very problematic for democracy and for military operations. So the first one of these is the living person no consent deepfake, LPNC. I'm in the Army, so I threw acronyms here because I'm hoping those catch fire. So what's a living person no consent deepfake? And I'll talk about this here in just a moment. But think about the February 22 President Zelensky deepfake urging the Ukrainian military to surrender, to lay down arms. He's a living person. He certainly did not consent to that deepfake. And presumably the Russian Federation published that with the intent of deceiving, harassing, tricking, delaying President Zelensky and the Ukrainians. So in March of 2023, just a couple months ago, The Intercept reported that United States Special Operations Command is interested in deepfakes, not just technology to detect harmful deepfakes, but rather potentially using deepfakes offensively. I'm going to skip ahead just because we're running out of time. Clearly, there are virtue ethics, deontological, ethics of care issues raised by the use of deepfakes, particularly where consent's not given. But let's keep going with the 5 categories. And I'll show again LPNC. There's President Zelensky depicted in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. The upper right-hand corner is Bruce Willis.
And that's a commercial for a company called Megaphone, which aired in Russia, of Bruce Willis endorsing a product. He never endorsed the product. Likewise, the gentleman pictured on the bottom there produces deepfakes of Tom Cruise walking into rooms and tripping on the floor, drinking beer, playing golf. Tom Cruise certainly didn't consent to any of those things being done, but through fairly democratized artificial intelligence applications, the guy can make deepfakes and put them on TikTok, and he's got tens of millions of viewers. What's his intent? Well, he says it's to mesmerize his audiences. So prepare to be mesmerized. This is our friend 007, pictured on the left on the red carpet, and on the right there is himself, maybe 20 years older. He didn't consent to this image. Is it inherently unethical that somebody created the image of him and published it on the internet? They stole his image and likeness. Are they being paid for it because we get to look at it and laugh? Those are rhetorical questions, but let's move on to LPC, the living person consent deepfake. That's me. And a selfie of me in a Toyota dealership taken 3 days ago. And then me pictured in 2070 or thereabouts. The point is here is I've consented to the use of this deepfake, and in the context of military operations, you could see how a living person consent deepfake might make sense. So for example, if there's a battlefield commander who creates a deepfake of himself or herself in 3 different locations, maybe that confuses the enemy and keeps maneuvering forces safe. Or maybe it causes the enemy to split his or her own forces and violate the principle of mass. Joe, if you could please click on this video and go to the 2:12-minute mark. This is scholarly work in the area of living person consent deepfakes. Next slide, please, Joe. All right, so in part, I just want to go the hard and liven the place up a bit. In part, I wanted to show you where the technology stands. That's 2 years old right there, and it's come quite a long way from what those University of California, Berkeley students were able to put together. But it mimics movement in a way now that's essentially not detectable to the human eye. We're at the point now where a deep fake is actually so good, even those produced in a basement using a free application, that I would say most people can't necessarily detect them. So we talked about living person consent deepfakes. Let's talk about dead person or deceased person no consent deepfakes, or DPNC. Those would include one like this. MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab put together a deepfake of President Richard Nixon. And we'll skip the video, Joe, but if you've not seen it, I recommend that you do check it out, of him giving a speech about the Apollo 11 mission being a failure and the astronauts passing away. In the military context, how could a DPNC deepfake potentially operate? I think about the raid against Osama bin Laden in May of 2011. As some of you all know, after that raid, much of the sensitive site exploitation was released to members of the public. Imagine if there were a video as part of the SSE showing Osama bin Laden saying disloyal things about Al-Qaeda. That could potentially have operational or even strategic effects. That would be a deceased person no consent application of deepfakes. Joe, if you could click that next slide for me, please. I've got 2 more categories. Next would be a deceased person who gives consent. Right now, it's sort of the rage in the literature because you have people like Tom Hanks, who's recently given an interview talking about after he dies, he'll keep acting. And he's going to protect his image and likeness so that his family continues to be paid, essentially. I think this is the future of deepfakes because it has a commercial application. But imagine President Zelensky is killed in Ukraine and somehow his nation is able to keep that a secret. very well-made deepfakes of him continuing to lead could be inspiring and therefore have operational strategic level effects. Similarly, a battlefield commander who's very influential or talented may consent to the creation of a number of deepfakes of him or her continuing to lead his or her troops. Finally, what I think is the most dangerous category of deepfakes is what I call the FP deepfake, or the fake person, fabricated person. And we're seeing on the left, Western-looking news anchors pop up online. Those are Russian-made fake people talking about how the United States policies are so misguided. On the right side, Chinese made, and you can see I've circled some of the anomalies in the technology, the chunk out of the ear and the one earring, which helps analysts identify what's fake and what's real. But this is probably the most dangerous for militaries, maybe not the most morally suspect, in the sense that you're not exploiting someone's image and likeness without their consent, but rather you're creating a tool to deceive. So some final thoughts here, and then I'll hand it over to Arthur, is I think deepfakes are morally suspect, but some more so than others. I think there's really difficult ethical and moral questions that we have to work out, but there certainly are military applications of this technology. And I don't think it's entirely scandalous that we investigate those. I think the obligation to telling the truth is negotiable in some military contexts. I can give you lots of examples of when we may not tell the truth in order to achieve some military effect. However, the obligation to treat others with humanity, probably not. And these are the things that I hope my paper helps people wrestle with in the coming months and years as we grapple with whether or not this is technology we want to engage in using, or rather leading the world in detecting and trying to eliminate. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now we have Arthur, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Arthur DeFelice. I'll echo the thanks that everyone before me laid out to our EEMT leadership. This has been, I don't know what to expect going into it, but I really learned a ton, and in an area where I knew nothing, now know very little. But the point is, it's been really a growth process for me, so I appreciate it very much. I'll similarly poll the audience. I've been doing this like throughout my course of time here, and now you're my captive audience, so I'll ask you. So unless you've heard of it from me, who here has heard of the DoD Serum repository? You have. I'll give you credit for that one. So I had certainly never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it, and I kind of pulled the thread a little bit, and I learned some things that I'd like to share with you, and then share the implications of those things. So since about the mid-80s, in earnest, as a complete joint effort across all branches of service, you guys, you know, when you go every 2 years, we all have HIV screening that's mandatory. Other things that we do on a mandatory basis are pre-deployment and post-deployment physicals that include a blood draw. Side note, and EEMT folks, you can answer this too. Who remembers ever signing a consent for the HIV blood draw? Being presented with even any sort of documentation for the HIV blood draw. I've discovered, and this is anecdotal, I've discovered that there is none. So the process, and I'm a reservist, maybe it's different, maybe it's not. The lab puts in an order for an HIV blood draw. I show up to the lab, they take my blood, and that's the end of it. Come to find out, the Department of Defense, since the mid-1980s, in earnest since the early 90s, takes that blood, separates it into whole blood, into serum, which I'll discuss separately, and they test the serum, or they test a portion of it for HIV. What remains, they send to a centralized location in the Washington, D.C. area. Those samples are collated by service member and social security number. They're matched with our DoD medical profile, and they're stored there in frozen form in perpetuity. So this thing called the Department of Defense Serum Repository contains over 70 million serum samples from well over 10 million service members. It contains samples from individuals who have started the medical onboarding process but never joined the military. And in some cases, it contains serum samples from military dependents. If they have blood draws under certain circumstances, for example, a birth at a DoD hospital where for whatever reason, including protocol, it's just the normal course of events, HIV testing is conducted, that is captured and retained in the Serum repository. Surprising, right? So the issues that I explore, and I'll discuss them briefly, is one, there's no informed consent or anything even approaching informed consent. Two, I'll suggest that based on this information and this database, which is certainly the largest of its type in the world, that a special relationship exists that imposes some duties upon the DoD for maintaining these things, especially in the form they do. Smaller, similar databases, it's not uncommon that commercial services, for example, will aggregate serum from different testing sites, but they're anonymized and permanently anonymized because they're, and I'll discuss this briefly in a moment, they're very valuable because serum samples, especially over a long period of time, a 20 or 30 plus year military career, contain a wealth of information that is very relevant and very helpful for different health studies to find correlations between different things that you might not have known about. But those commercial databases are anonymized and irretrievably anonymized, whereas the DoD database, I'll discuss some of the finer points, but it's not exactly anonymized. And last is that as technology develops, this presents a potential threat vector that was probably not considered at the time of the origination of this Serum repository. So a few just minor points that I'll discuss with you about my learning process as it relates to the Serum repository. The first is ownership of your own genetic material. So I'll just cut right to the chase for the sake of time. We don't own our own genetic material, nor our tissue or body samples after they're separated from our body. There's a string of court cases that discusses this, but the point is you can't copyright or patent your own DNA profile, and you can't assert any ownership interests over your own bodily material once it's legitimately separated from you, okay? There's a difference, it's a little hair splitting that doesn't apply to the informed consent issue, and the case that I'll describe to you illustrates the point. There was a woman decades ago named Henrietta Lacks. She underwent a procedure at, I think it was UCLA. They took a bunch of her cells in the screening and treatment process for a specific type of cancer that she had. She passed away. Unbeknownst to her at that time, they retained her cells. They were able to replicate them in a lab, and they used them for all sorts of research and commercial purposes. This was completely unbeknownst to her and to her family, and the use of these cells has led to significant profits on the part of pharmaceutical companies who have been able to profit from their use. So this illustrates the point. She and her family do not own the cells or their genetic material. Once they're legitimately, and that's the key word, separated from her, they're no longer her property to control their disposition. The legality, I guess, in this case is there's no informed consent. So she was deprived of the opportunity to make a choice about the disposition of her cells at the origination. Some of you might be familiar with the lawsuit that's going on about that, and I can answer questions about it. It's not exactly relevant except for the point that I've just made. So I learned that you cannot exert control over your own bodily material once it's legitimately separated from your body. But that just brought me back to the issue of informed consent. And the history of informed consent, I always thought of it going into this endeavor as something that's sacrosanct within the medical community and inviolable and sort of, from on high. Come to find out, like many things in our modern world, it's really an extension of the lessons that we learned after World War II. So the Nuremberg tribunal that was investigating various German atrocities, one of a separate category is medical atrocities that were alleged to have been committed, and many were found guilty of committing these medical atrocities. And a big theme was lack of informed consent. And without getting into all the details, our own American Medical Association gave some pushback to the panel as we were developing rules about informed consent, because there were many cases in the US, arguably, where informed consent was not sought or certainly not under the guidelines that we know about today. Examples that come to mind, even after the establishment of the AMAs and the Nuremberg Code understandings of informed consent include the Tuskegee, I think it was syphilis experimentation, MK Ultra, prison experiments that continued outside of our current understanding of informed consent, even until the fairly recent past. So those kind of raised my radar about the importance of informed consent in this specific instance, and especially as we consider possible threat vectors, which I'll discuss shortly. Now, the DoD Serum repository to me at first sounded scary and imposing, and it kind of is. It kind of sounds like sci-fi, like that's blood on our hands. That's where the title came from. But there are certainly legitimate uses to this repository. It came into my consciousness in a friend of mine passed along a study to me that found a link between Epstein-Barr virus, which causes mono, and the potential for developing MS into someone's older age. So that's pointed researchers in a new direction as to find these correlations. And that came as a result of studies done through the DoD Serum repository, which without the use of these longitudinal, long period of time samples for the same set of people who you can also track their health results, this link would not have been possible, and potential treatments in the future might not have been possible. So there are certainly legitimate uses of this data. The danger is, and this is kind of an analogy, if that's even the right term, that I've been toying around with. It came to me while I was sitting there. So my wife sometimes correctly accuses me of being a hoarder, right? Like if you look at our garage, you might agree. There's like, my classic thing is scrap wood that I've used for projects, right? And I keep it there, and she's like, why would you ever have this? And I said, well, you never know. You might need it someday, or I might need it someday, and I might come to use it someday. It seems to me that the Serum repository kind of grew in this way. It's like, well, we're taking all these samples. Originally, they were taking them to study the efficacy of their HIV screening over a period of time. Like, okay, that makes sense. That question has since been answered, yet they're still continuing to accumulate more and more samples in a way that few people, I think, know about it. So, you know, I would say that I have a purpose for when I keep that stuff in my garage, but the purpose only becomes apparent to me after the fact, after a need develops. And the Serum repository seems in some ways similar to that. It's just an accumulation of these long history longitudinal serum samples that are not well known. Its existence is not well known enough to be as useful as it should be. In the course of my research, I've discussed this with medical professionals at Brown who do medical research. They didn't know about it, and they were very intrigued to learn about it because it's a potential avenue for them to do. This person works in cancer studies, and potential avenue for them to do some additional research. So one thing I'll point out before going on to my recommendation, what is serum? So serum is different from whole blood. Whole blood is what they take out in the needle, and it contains red blood cells, serum, the liquid substrate that the solid materials float around in. The serum is what happens when you separate, you take out the whole blood cells and you're left with just the serum, which contains, again, a liquid that the blood cells float around in, and it can contain some proteins and other things that it go into the serum, because serum is a communicant with your entire body. So the serum in your body communicates with all your organs, and it can help to pass messages from one part of your body to another. And things like proteins and lipids and stuff are a result of that process. There's no DNA in serum, at least that had been the primary understanding up until relatively recently, when small strands of DNA were able to be isolated from serum. And that can happen through a variety of reasons. So the DNA is contained in the red and white blood cells. The process of processing serum takes out those materials, and the thinking was takes out the DNA as well. Again, come to find out, through a variety of processes, some are natural. For example, certain ailments or physical conditions can cause your cells to break down and cause that DNA to be free floating in the serum, and thus not separated when they process the serum. In some other cases, the process of taking the blood can cause some cells to rupture and can cause your DNA to become it's called cell-free DNA retrievable in your serum. Through my research, I found that there are private lab companies that will charge you a couple $100s to buy equipment that allows you to separate genomic sequences from serum. So I consider this to be a potential threat vector, like a black swan or black mirror type of scenario where, you know, say a sophisticated adversary has knowledge of this repository, and they, a national leader like a president is a veteran, and therefore his serum is in this repository. Study could be designed specifically to obtain access to that information, and then they could be used for malicious purposes, including specifically targeting an individual based on their genomic profile. Maybe a low likelihood but high impact event. The same could be true of relatives of a national leader or target. If there's one or more relatives who are in the profile in the repository, even though this national leader or the target is not, the same sort of scenario could play out in my estimation. So my recommendations, one, the first is a layup, which is informed consent. And it's a complicated topic, the DoD repository, the serum repository, but it could be as simple as, hey, we're taking your blood for HIV testing. We also have this repository. Click here or scan this QR code for more information if you're so inclined. Second is that I don't have time to get too into it, I'm afraid. I'm a lawyer, so I like talk too much probably. The second is that I think that with all this valuable data at DoD's fingertips, there is a special relationship to at least inform study participants of the fact that they are in the study and what the results of the study are as it applies to them. And third is they periodically, the last one was about 15 years ago, the Serum repository does an introspective study on ways to improve. At least from my research, the threat vector part of it has not been part of that internal process. So I think they certainly know better about the technology and their own processes than I do. They should take a look at possible threat vectors because some of this is available to study academic institutions for the purpose of doing studies. So they should take a look at what those vulnerabilities might be. So that's all. I'll look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you.
As you can see, our EEMT students do some mind-bending work. And we have some here in the audience, as well as those who are on the panel that'll be completing their work here in a matter of days and doing the final touches. So
Thanks, and I'll just take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists. It's a busy time of year to ask you to do one more thing, but I think it's important to share what you all have been doing with the War College.
thank you. I want to thank Dr. Schultz and Dr. Shays-Klein for their support, their heavy involvement in this program that has helped to make it a success. And certainly the mind-bending work that our EMT experts, because when they finish this program, they are truly experts in ethics of technology to go out into the respective places of work and to utilize their expertise, because I can guarantee you hardly anyone else where they go has the knowledge that they have gained. And so we do need to multiply it, and we do need to spread the word about the need for this new discipline of ethics of technology. So thank you for our Zoom audience, as well as thank you for those in person for coming and participating and engaging with us. And we look forward to more thinking. Thank you. Good day.